Protests against ICE intensify in Los Angeles and nationwide, a comprehensive report. June 10, 2025. In the wake of intensified immigration raids and systemic changes to immigration policy under the Trump administration, protests against the Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE agency have erupted in Los Angeles and spread across the United States, galvanizing a significant movement among activists and community members. The demonstrations began over the weekend with thousands of participants taking to the streets to express their outrage over the treatment of undocumented migrants and the government's immigration policies. Event timeline. June 7, 2025, the protests commenced in Los Angeles, marked by chants, banners, and passionate speeches. Demonstrators rallied against the recent ICE raids that have led to the detention and deportation of numerous undocumented individuals. Highlighting personal stories of families torn apart by these policies. The atmosphere was charged with emotion as many participants shared their experiences and the impact on their communities. June 8, 2025, the protests escalated in intensity, resulting in approximately 56 arrests. In a controversial and unprecedented move, President Trump deployed around 700 Marines and over 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles to manage the situation. This decision drew sharp criticism from California Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, who labeled the deployment unlawful and indicated plans to sue the federal government. The presence of military personnel in a civilian protest sparked outrage among activists who saw it as an attack on their First Amendment rights. June 9, 2025, protests continued to grow, spreading to cities such as San Francisco, where thousands marched in peaceful demonstrations. However, some groups engaged in vandalism, leading to further arrests. Activists emphasized the need for solidarity across the nation against what they termed oppressive immigration policies. The San Francisco Police Department reported that while most of the march remained peaceful, small factions committed acts of vandalism, resulting in several arrests. June 10, 2025, the unrest expanded further with events organized in cities including New York, Chicago, Dallas, and Atlanta. Activists coordinated demonstrations under the slogan "No Kings," denouncing the oppressive nature of the raids. Reports from New York indicated at least 9 arrests during a tense standoff at Trump Tower, where protesters clashed with police while attempting to block traffic. Additional gatherings occurred in Boston, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, showcasing the widespread nature of the protests. Key themes and issues. 1. National movement against ICE. The protests are part of a broader national movement against ICE and the Trump administration's immigration policies. Highlighting a growing disenchantment with the treatment of immigrants in the U.S., activists are uniting across state lines to demand justice and reform. 2. Police response and arrests. As protests escalated, law enforcement's response became increasingly aggressive, leading to numerous arrests. The number of arrests varied by location, with significant numbers reported in Los Angeles and San Francisco. The deployment of military personnel to manage civilian protests raised concerns about the militarization of police in the U.S. 3. Personal impact and community stories. Many protesters shared personal narratives about the immigration policy's impact on their families, emphasizing the emotional stakes involved. These stories resonated deeply within the community, humanizing the statistics and political rhetoric surrounding immigration issues. Comparative analysis of news coverage. NPR provided a general overview of events, focusing on the ongoing nature of the protests without delving into specific details about arrests or the scale of demonstrations. The coverage highlighted the protests' continuity into the week. NBC News offered a more detailed account of the events, including specific numbers of arrests and responses from law enforcement. This coverage linked the local protests to a broader national context, emphasizing the coordinated efforts of activists across various cities. CNN experienced technical issues that limited access to their coverage, reflecting varying levels of reporting efficiency across different platforms. This inconsistency in coverage may have affected the public's understanding of the protest's scope and significance. Community reactions and future actions. The protests have sparked a range of reactions from community members and local leaders. Many activists expressed a commitment to continuing their efforts until significant changes are made to immigration policy. The diverse coalition of protesters included not only immigrant rights advocates but also trade unionists, students, and concerned citizens who see the impact of these policies on their communities. Upcoming events are scheduled to continue the momentum of the protests, with activists planning further demonstrations across the country. The No Kings rallies are set to take place nationwide, reinforcing the message that the fight against oppressive immigration policies will persist. Conclusion. The protests against ICE in Los Angeles have become a catalyst for a national movement, highlighting widespread dissent against current immigration policies. The integration of personal narratives, police responses, and coordinated actions across cities underscores the urgency and passion of the activists involved. As the demonstrations continue, the implications for immigration policy and community rights in the United States remain significant, with activists determined to make their voices heard in the struggle for justice and equity. The situation is dynamic, and the coming days will reveal the extent to which these protests will influence national discourse on immigration and civil rights. The protests against ICE in Los Angeles have highlighted several counterintuitive aspects of the situation. Below are the key points that reveal these contradictions. 1. Escalation of federal force versus local resistance. The deployment of 700 Marines and over 2,000 National Guard troops by President Trump in response to protests signifies an extreme federal intervention. This move, which is typically associated with military action in foreign conflicts, is being used domestically against citizens exercising their right to protest. This creates a counterintuitive situation where the government meant to protect civil liberties is deploying military force against its own populace. This is compounded by the fact that California's leadership, including Governor Gavin Newsom and Mayor Karen Bass, are vehemently opposing this action, arguing that it violates state rights and constitutional protections. The very entity that is supposed to ensure safety and order is becoming a source of oppression, which contradicts the foundational principles of democracy. 2. Peaceful protest versus vandalism narrative. While the majority of protesters are reported to be peaceful, the narrative is often skewed to focus on incidents of vandalism and violence. This presents a counterintuitive image where a largely nonviolent movement is overshadowed by the actions of a few. This selective reporting can mislead the public about the nature of the protests, suggesting that there is widespread chaos when in fact the protests are largely organized around peaceful expression of dissent. The media's focus on negative actions can detract from the legitimate concerns raised by the protesters regarding immigration policy and human rights. 3. Broad support versus criminalization. Demonstrations across the nation are drawing diverse groups, including trade unionists and families of immigrants, which reflects a broad base of support against ICE's actions. However, these supporters are often treated as criminals when they engage in civil disobedience. The counterintuitive implication here is that while public sentiment may support the cause, the legal repercussions faced by activists create a chilling effect on free speech and assembly. This contradiction highlights the struggle between public opinion and governmental response to dissent. For personal narratives versus political discourse, many protesters shared deeply personal stories about the impact of immigration policies on their families, which humanizes the issue and fosters empathy. However, political discourse often reduces these complex narratives to mere statistics or political points. This disconnect between personal experiences and political rhetoric presents a counterintuitive reality where policymakers may ignore the human impact of their decisions, prioritizing political agendas over the well-being of individuals. This can lead to a lack of genuine understanding and compassion in policymaking. 5. National movement versus local responses. While the protests are framed as part of a national movement, local responses vary significantly. Cities like San Francisco and New York see large turnouts and significant media coverage, while protests in smaller cities might not receive the same attention or support. This creates a counterintuitive scenario where the intensity of the movement is not uniformly reflected across the country. The disparity in local responses can lead to a fragmented understanding of the movement's significance, diluting the nationwide message against ICE policies. 6. Government's stance on lawfulness versus military actions. The legal action taken by California against the federal government for deploying National Guard troops underscores a counterintuitive legal and ethical dilemma. The federal government claims authority under law to enforce immigration policies, yet the use of military force against civilians raises questions about the legitimacy of such actions. This contradiction between the proclaimed lawfulness of immigration enforcement and the unlawful nature of military deployment against peaceful protesters creates a complex legal landscape that challenges the notion of justice and accountability in governance. 7. Activism's effectiveness versus government resistance. Despite the protests and public outcry, figures like Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem have stated that ICE will continue its operations regardless of the protests. This highlights a counterintuitive dynamic where grassroots activism appears to have limited impact on federal policy. While social movements can shift public opinion, the entrenched positions of government officials suggest that there are significant barriers to change, challenging the effectiveness of protests in achieving immediate policy reform. These counterintuitive elements reflect a complex interplay of government actions, public sentiment, media portrayal, and the realities faced by individuals affected by immigration policies. The protests against ICE in Los Angeles and beyond are not just a response to specific policies but are emblematic of broader struggles for justice, civil rights, and the fundamental principles of democracy. The protests against immigration and customs enforcement ICE in Los Angeles have drawn significant attention. But several crucial aspects of the events and their implications may be overlooked. Here are some important elements and their significance. 1. Deployment of military forces. One of the most striking aspects of the protests was President Trump's decision to deploy around 700 Marines and over 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles in response to the unrest. This military response to civil protests is significant for several reasons. Escalation of tensions. The deployment represents a significant escalation in the government's response to civil disobedience. Military presence can heighten tensions between protesters and law enforcement, potentially leading to violent confrontations and further unrest. Legal and constitutional implications. California officials, including Governor Gavin Newsom, criticized the deployment as unlawful and announced plans to sue the federal government. This sets a precedent for legal battles over the use of military forces in domestic law enforcement, raising questions about state versus federal authority and the limits of executive power. 2. Personal narratives of protesters. The emotional stakes of the protests are often encapsulated in the personal stories shared by participants. For instance, Vanessa Garcia Morales' testimony about her immigrant family's fears highlights the real human impact of ICE policies. This personal connection is significant because humanizing the issue. While statistics and policy discussions are important, personal stories can evoke empathy and drive public support for the protesters' cause. They illustrate the tangible consequences of immigration policies on families and communities, making the issue more relatable to the general public. Mobilization of solidarity. Personal narratives can motivate others to join the movement. As people see the broader implications of these policies affecting not just individuals but entire communities, the emotional resonance of these stories can lead to increased participation and solidarity across various demographics. 3. Nationwide coordination and solidarity. The protests in Los Angeles were part of a larger coordinated movement across the country, with events planned in cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. This national solidarity is significant for a few reasons. Strength in numbers. The spread of protests emphasizes that opposition to ICE and immigration policies is not limited to one region or demographic. It demonstrates a widespread discontent that can lead to a more unified national movement, potentially influencing political discourse and policy changes. Sustained pressure. By organizing simultaneous events in multiple cities, activists can maintain pressure on government officials and keep the issue in the public eye. This can be crucial for driving legislative changes and ensuring that the voices of those affected by these policies are heard. 4. Police response and arrests. The number of arrests during the protests, particularly in Los Angeles and San Francisco, reflects a significant aspect of the law enforcement's approach to civil unrest. The police response is noteworthy because civil liberties concerns. The arrests, especially when protesters are expressing their First Amendment rights, raise concerns about civil liberties and the right to protest. The extent of arrests can deter future activism and lead to fears of over-policing. Public perception of law enforcement. How police handle protests can shape public perception of law enforcement agencies. A heavy-handed approach may lead to increased animosity towards police, while a more restrained response could foster trust and collaboration between law enforcement and communities. 5. Media coverage disparities. The differences in media coverage among outlets like NPR, NBC News, and CNN can reveal biases and affect public understanding of the events. Framing of events. The way media outlets report on the protests, focusing on violence, arrests, or peaceful demonstrations, can shape public perception and influence the narrative around the protests. This framing can either amplify or downplay the urgency of addressing immigration policies. Access to information. The technical issues faced by CNN, which limited access to their coverage, highlight the challenges of information dissemination in real-time situations. This can lead to gaps in public knowledge and understanding of the protests and their implications. 6. Impact on future policy. The protests against ICE are part of a broader conversation about immigration policy in the United States. Their significance lies in political mobilization. The mobilization of activists and public dissent against ICE can influence future elections and the political landscape. Politicians may feel pressured to address immigration reform in response to the growing public outcry. Potential for legislative change. Sustained protests may lead to change in policy at both the state and federal levels, as public awareness grows and more people become involved. There is potential for legislative initiatives aimed at reforming immigration laws and practices. Conclusion. The protests against ICE in Los Angeles and their spread across the nation signify a critical moment in the public's response to immigration policies. The deployment of military forces, the personal narratives shared by protesters, the coordinated national movement, police responses, media coverage disparities, and the potential for future policy changes all present significant implications for the immigration debate in the United States. These aspects are vital for understanding the depth and complexity of the situation, as they highlight not only the immediate impact of the protests but also the broader societal and political ramifications that may unfold in the coming weeks and months. For valuable points for in-depth analysis and discussion on protests against ICE in Los Angeles. 1. Escalation and national coordination of protests. The protests in Los Angeles were not isolated events but rather part of a coordinated national movement against immigration and customs enforcement, ICE, and the Trump administration's immigration policies. The timeline indicates that protests began in Los Angeles on June 7, 2025, and quickly spread to other major cities including San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Dallas, and Atlanta. The use of social media, grassroots organizing, and existing networks among activist groups played a crucial role in mobilizing individuals across the country. This national solidarity highlights the interconnectedness of local actions and broader systemic issues related to immigration enforcement. Analyzing the strategies used to coordinate these protests can shed light on contemporary activism's effectiveness and challenges in the face of federal authority. 2. Government response and militarization. The Trump administration's response to the protests, particularly the deployment of approximately 700 Marines and over 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles, raises significant concerns about the militarization of local law enforcement and the implications for civil liberties. The reactions from California Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, who labeled the deployment as unlawful and announced intentions to sue the federal government, reflect a clash between state and federal authority. This situation invites an examination of the legal and ethical ramifications of using military resources for domestic policing, particularly in contexts where civil rights are at stake. Discussing the balance between maintaining order and respecting citizens' rights to protest is essential for understanding the dynamics of governance and civil society. 3. Impact of immigration policies on communities. Many protesters shared personal stories about how immigration enforcement policies affected their families, underscoring the emotional and social stakes involved in the protests. These narratives highlight the human impact of ICE raids and deportations, drawing attention to the fear and instability experienced by immigrant communities. Analyzing these personal accounts can provide insight into the lived experiences of those directly affected by immigration policies and the broader implications for community cohesion and resilience. Furthermore, understanding the intersectionality of race-class and immigration status within these narratives can enhance discussions about social justice and equity in the United States. 4. Media representation and coverage variability. The differences in how various media outlets reported on the protests reveal significant insights into the framing of social movements and the role of journalism in shaping public perception. For example, NPR provided a general overview while NBC News focused on detailed accounts of arrests and police responses, indicating varying levels of engagement with the issues at hand. The technical difficulties encountered by CNN further illustrate the challenges media organizations face in covering dynamic events. Analyzing the media's framing of the protests can help to understand how narratives are constructed, the potential for bias, and the impact of coverage on public opinion and policy discourse. Exploring the role of social media in complementing or challenging traditional news coverage is also relevant in this context. Conclusion. The protests against ICE in Los Angeles serve as a microcosm of broader national tensions regarding immigration policy, civil rights, and state versus federal authority. By examining the escalation and coordination of protests, government responses, the impact of immigration policies on communities, and media representation, we can gain a deeper understanding of the complexities surrounding this pivotal moment in American social movements. These points provide a foundation for further exploration and discussion of the ongoing challenges and opportunities in advocating for immigrant rights and social justice. 1. Stonewall Riots 1969. The Stonewall Riots were a series of spontaneous demonstrations by members of the LGBTQ+ community in response to a police raid at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. The riots, which began on June 28, 1969, lasted for several days and are widely considered to be a pivotal moment in the LGBTQ+ rights movement. The events at Stonewall galvanized LGBTQ+ activists and led to the formation of various advocacy groups as well as the establishment of pride events around the world. The riots highlighted the community's struggle against systemic discrimination and police brutality, similar to the protests against ICE's immigration enforcement policies. 2. Civil Rights Movement 1950s to 1960s. The Civil Rights Movement was a pivotal series of events aimed at ending racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans in the United States. Key events such as the Montgomery bus boycott 1955 and the March on Washington 1963 involved large-scale protests and demonstrations that drew attention to the injustices faced by African Americans. Activists faced violent backlash and arrests, yet the movement achieved significant legislative victories, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This movement shares common themes with the protests against ICE, particularly in terms of fighting against oppressive governmental policies and seeking justice and equality. 3. Anti-Vietnam War protests 1960s to 1970s. The anti-Vietnam War protests were a series of demonstrations against the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, which escalated significantly in the 1960s. Activists including students and veterans organized large-scale protests across the country, culminating in significant events like the Kent State shootings in 1970, where 4 students were killed by the National Guard during a protest. These protests highlighted widespread dissent against government policies and military actions, drawing parallels to the recent protests against ICE, where activism is also focused on challenging the government's enforcement actions and policies. The protests against Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) in Los Angeles and across the United States highlight a growing national movement focused on immigration reform and human rights. As these protests unfold, they reveal deep societal divisions and raise critical questions about the future of immigration policy in the U.S. Here are predictions for the future outlook based on current trends. 1. Increased activism and mobilization. The protests indicate a surge in grassroots activism, particularly around issues of immigration and human rights. As communities become more engaged, we can expect to see sustained protests. Activist groups will likely continue organizing demonstrations not only in response to ICE actions but also to advocate for comprehensive immigration reform. This could manifest as regular nationwide events, rallies, and public awareness campaigns aimed at influencing policy. Coalition building. Various organizations, including labor unions, civil rights groups, and faith-based organizations, are likely to form coalitions. These alliances will strengthen the movement by pooling resources and amplifying messages. 2. Policy changes and legislative action. The ongoing protests may lead to significant shifts in immigration policy. Local and state-level actions. States like California, which are actively resisting federal immigration policies, may implement more protective measures for undocumented immigrants. This could include sanctuary laws, legal support for immigrants, or state-funded programs aimed at integration. Federal legislative response. As public pressure mounts, Congress could be compelled to address immigration reform more seriously. This may lead to proposed legislation aimed at protecting undocumented individuals, creating pathways to citizenship, and reforming ICE practices. 3. Continued tensions between federal and state governments. The deployment of National Guard troops and the federal response to protests signals a potential escalation in tensions. Legal battles. States may engage in protracted legal disputes with the federal government over immigration enforcement, particularly concerning state rights versus federal mandates. The outcomes of these legal battles could set significant precedents for future governance. Increased militarization. The federal government may continue to increase its military presence in response to protests, leading to heightened tensions in urban areas and potential conflicts between state law enforcement and federal authorities. 4. Shift in public opinion. Public sentiment regarding immigration and ICE practices may evolve. Increased awareness. As personal stories from affected families gain traction in media coverage, public awareness around the realities of immigration enforcement may lead to a shift in attitudes, especially among moderate and undecided voters. Generational changes. Younger generations, who are generally more progressive on social issues, may increasingly take up the mantle of activism, further influencing national discourse on immigration policy. 5. Impact on political landscape. The ongoing protests and the issues surrounding ICE could reshape the political landscape. Elections and candidate platforms. Immigration will likely become a pivotal issue in upcoming elections, with candidates needing to articulate clear stances on the matter. This could affect elections at all levels, from local mayoral races to national congressional seats. Policy platforms of political parties. The Democratic Party may adopt more progressive immigration policies to align with the activist base, while the Republican Party may double down on enforcement rhetoric. leading to further polarization. 6. Social media and technology's role. The role of social media and technology in organizing and mobilizing protests will continue to grow. Viral activism. Social media platforms will remain crucial for spreading awareness and organizing protests. Hashtags and online campaigns can quickly mobilize supporters and draw international attention. Digital security. As protests become more widespread, issues related to surveillance and digital security for activists will emerge, prompting discussions about privacy rights and the protection of personal data. 7. Long-term changes in immigration policy. Looking further ahead, the protests may contribute to a significant rethinking of immigration policy in the U.S. Comprehensive immigration reform. There may be a push for a comprehensive approach that addresses not only enforcement but also pathways to citizenship, refugee protections, and the treatment of undocumented individuals. Human rights framework. Future policies may increasingly incorporate a human rights framework, focusing on the dignity and rights of individuals rather than purely punitive measures. Conclusion. As the protests against ICE continue, they are likely to catalyze a broader national conversation about immigration in the United States. The interplay between grassroots activism, state responses, and federal policies will shape the future of immigration in the coming years. The outcome will depend on the ability of activists to sustain momentum, the political will to enact change, and the evolving public sentiment surrounding these crucial issues. Ultimately, the path forward will require a balance between enforcement and compassion, reflecting the values of a diverse society.